tea. Hi, I'm Teresa from Phoenix Gate Crafts, and today let's talk about tea. I know this isn't my usual subject matter because I'm normally talking about yarny goodness and knitting and crochet concepts, but I felt today was kind of a fun thing if I talked about one of our crafty friends' favorite beverages. So when you're knitting or crocheting and it's late at night, what are your drinking options? You can have coffee, but that's a lot of caffeine. You can have decaf, but that's still some caffeine. But a truly decaf option are herbal teas. Tea is a very popular option all the way around the world. There is a vast history of tea that I am not getting into because that itself is its own video and I'm not interested in that. And it's something I really enjoy. I was actually a tea drinker before I was a coffee drinker, and quite frankly, I need far more milk and sugar in my coffee than I do in tea. If I don't have sugar for my tea, I'm like, okay, I'll drink it anyway, and it's usually fine. But wait, I might hear you say, you don't like tea. It is very bitter and weird tasting. And to that I respond, did you get it from Starbucks? Because they suck at making tea. I actually worked in a coffee shop for a while that was owned by a tea company. So between that and the fact that I get a Sips by box every month, I will be doing a review in a future video of the Sips by box. So keep an eye out for that. I've actually learned that there are some proper ways to brew tea that make a much better tasting cup that really cuts that nasty bitterness that sugar can't really cover up. On a side note, in coffee, cow's milk honestly works best if you want to cut the bitterness. Sugar may sweeten coffee, but cow's milk is actually what cuts the bitterness. So if you're not liking almond milk or coconut milk or oat milk in your coffee, that's probably why it's not actually cutting the bitterness. To get into some information about tea, there are 3 kinds of tea that aren't actually 3 kinds of tea. They are actually 3 different methods of drying and preserving tea. And those create black tea, green tea, and white tea. There's also a 4th kind of tea that technically isn't a tea, and that's herbal tea. Herbal tea is a type of tisane where you are taking different types of plant matter that's not tea. So it can be lemon or orange peels that are dried. It can be cinnamon or other spices that are also dried and preserved. It can be herbs. It can be flowers. It can be a whole bunch of different stuff. It can be roots. Turmeric is a root and it's actually pretty good in tea. So those are not technically tea because they're not using tea leaves. But the tea leaves can be dried in 3 different methods that honestly I don't understand. But they do different things to the leaves. And depending on that, you can brew tea in different ways depending on the kind of tea you're getting. So let's talk about herbal tea first, just because it's honestly the easiest. And there are so many different kinds. Now, you can brew herbal tea for 2 reasons. One is just to enjoy because you like the taste of it, and one is actually for medicinal purposes. If you believe in herbal medicine, some of it is valid, some of it is actually very well researched, and some of it not so much. So it's a bit of a grab bag on what actually works and what doesn't, and understanding the reasons why and the chemicals involved. So good luck doing your research on that. Consult a doctor if you're trying to treat any medical condition, just to make sure it's not going to interact with any other medicine. But if you're making herbal tea to enjoy, it is honestly the simplest process. Boil your water, and while it's at a boiling temperature, pour over your herbal tea and let it steep for about 5 minutes. Sweeten and doctor as desired, and then drink and enjoy. Honestly, the easiest thing ever. If you're doing it for medicinal purposes, you're not going to want to just let it steep for 5 minutes. You're probably going to want to let it steep for about 10 to 20 minutes depending on the specific plant matter that you are steeping, because you want the full effect of the chemicals that are in those plants. So that you're going to have to decide based on the plant matter you're using. And again, good luck researching that. Consult a doctor. I am not a doctor. Now, the actual part about tea. So black tea, green tea, and white tea are all a little bit different. Black tea actually of the three has the most caffeine, and caffeine works with tea in your body a little bit differently than caffeine in coffee. It works by entering your system in a different way, and it works on your neuroreceptors in a different way. So something about caffeine, quick side tangent, is that caffeine doesn't actually give you more energy. What it does is it prevents you from getting tired by blocking certain neuroreceptors. Caffeine from tea kind of keeps you stable through the entire lifetime of the tea in your system, which actually is about 6 to 12 hours, which is why a lot of doctors recommend not having caffeine after about 3 p.m. if you want to go to sleep at a reasonable time. Because of this consistency and the higher efficacy of caffeine from tea, because of how it enters your system, black tea of the three tea types has the most caffeine, and it only has about 50% of the caffeine of a similar sized cup of coffee. Comparatively, green tea and white tea only have 10 to 25% of the caffeine of a cup of coffee. But it's much more effective. Also, antioxidants. All tea has antioxidants, but white tea actually has the most antioxidant of the three types. And that's because not so many of the antioxidants are burnt off in its particular drying process. The most hardy of the three leaves is black tea. Black tea, unless you're told otherwise by the specific tea that you are drinking, can be brewed using boiling water. So boiling water is 212 degrees Fahrenheit and 100 degrees Celsius. And so basically, it's really easy to brew black tea. You boil your water, so you can boil it in the microwave, you can boil it on the stove. If you have a water boiler, you can use that too. It really doesn't matter because boiled water is boiled water. And then you pour it over your tea leaves, not the other way around. And you can let it steep for 5 minutes, anywhere from 3 to 5 minutes. Personally, I like my black teas brewed at about 4 minutes. And you only need about 1 teaspoon of loose leaf tea or 1 tea bag for about 8 to 16 ounces of water. So 1 to 2 cups. Let it steep for 5 minutes. Remove the tea bag, and then you can add any sugar, lemon, or milk to it that you choose. And at that point, you're good. If you go for more than about 5 minutes, you'll notice that more of the bitter flavor is getting into your tea. And in fact, all three types of teas, if you over brew, so if you let it go for longer than the recommended time, you're going to get more and more bitter flavors as time goes on. So it's a good way to avoid bitter flavors. Green tea and white tea are more delicate. So you actually need to brew them at a lower temperature for less time, because if you shock the tea too much, or if you let it go for too long, you're much more likely to get bitter flavors. So green and white teas should be brewed at 175 to 185 degrees Fahrenheit, give or take, which is about 80 to 85 degrees Celsius. You still want about 1 teaspoon of loose leaf tea or 1 tea bag per 8 to 16 ounces of water. Now, this gets into a question of, but I want a stronger or a weaker tea. Well, for a weaker tea, that's easy because you just brew it for less time. green and white teas should typically be brewed for between 2 and 4 minutes. And I typically brew both of those for about 3 minutes apiece. But if you want a weaker tea, go ahead and brew it for less time. Another option though is to affect the amount of water per tea, that ratio of water to tea. If you want stronger tea, put more tea leaves in. Because the longer steeping results in a bitter tasting brew, adding more tea leaves is going to create more concentrated tea. So it's better if you want something stronger, maybe instead of using a teaspoon of tea per 2 cups of water, use 1.5 to 2 teaspoons per 2 cups of water. And the same goes for if you're brewing a pot of tea. Typically you want about 1 teaspoon for the first cup of tea and perhaps about 1/2 teaspoon to 3/4 teaspoon of tea per additional cup. And you can adjust from there. I typically like it a little stronger, so I just do 1 teaspoon per cup of water. Makes it much easier. But you'll still want it to only be that 4 or 5 minutes of steep time that you're going to brew that tea for anyway. If you're brewing in a teapot, you want to warm the teapot first. Basically, I call it banishing the cold. Basically, while you're waiting for your water to fully boil, you'll want to get some hot water and just pour a little bit into your teapot first and let it sit for about a minute or 2. Then, when you're ready to actually make your tea, you'll dump that water, put in your tea bags and your water like you normally would, let it steep, and then remove the tea. That way, you're actually going to keep your tea warmer for longer. And if you want a really cool knitting or crochet project, you can make a teapot cozy, because those go over the teapot with a little hole for the spout and the handle, and it will insulate the heat into the teapot for just a little bit longer. So if you're having a nice little tea party and you're not running through the tea very fast because you're talking too much, you're not going to necessarily have as cold of tea for your second cup. You can also make little cozies for your tea cup that go have a little thing that comes through here and then comes around. I don't want that for this because I have a pretty cool little saying on my cup. I got this from a local yarn shop in Arizona when I visited. Anyway, so that's hot tea. Cold tea is actually a very similar process. You still want to brew it for the same amount of time, because when you're brewing tea, you pretty much have to brew it hot and then let it get cold. Here's the thing about tea that isn't necessarily true of coffee. You need a little bit of heat to agitate the water molecules so that it grabs onto the tea and pulls the flavor out. You need at least a little bit of heat for this. So you can cold brew tea. It's called sun tea because basically you put your tea and your water in like a jar or something and set it out in the sun. The sun will create enough heat that you get enough agitation that you're going to leach some of the flavor from the tea into the water, and you let it sit for about anywhere from 4 to about 16 hours. You can cold brew tea, like truly cold brew it at room temperature. Don't go for more than 16 hours doing this, but it may not be as strong because tea really responds well to warm water compared to cold water. Most people brew warm tea and then pour it over ice. So if you're going to do that, you need to double up the amount of tea that you're brewing. So if you're brewing just 1 cup of iced tea, you want to brew 1 cup of hot water. That's the appropriate temperature for the kind of tea that you are brewing, and you need to double the amount of tea you're doing. So if you normally do 1 tea bag for hot, you'll want to do 2 tea bags for iced. If you do 1 teaspoon of loose leaf for hot, you want to do 2 teaspoons of loose leaf for cold. You want to brew it extra strong because when you pour it over ice, the ice is going to melt and water down your tea. Also, if you're adding sugar, you'll want to add sugar during the hot stage. So you can let tea cool down before putting it over ice. You brew your hot tea, let it cool down to room temperature, and then stick a pitcher of it in the fridge. That is totally legit. However, sugar doesn't truly dissolve. Dissolving is actually what salt does in water, where it actually creates a different chemical bond. So salt water is where the salt chemically bonds to the hydrogen molecules in the water, creating a different compound. Sugar doesn't do that. When sugar gets cold, it's more likely to re-solidify on the bottom of the pitcher. So if you're just brewing hot tea and then pouring it over ice, adding the sugar to the tea while it's hot and mixing it in will be perfectly fine. It'll stay mixed once you get it cold again. But if you've got people who like different levels of sweetness, so you've got somebody who likes it sweeter than somebody else and you're just making a pitcher of tea for everybody, you might want to make simple syrup, which is just sugar water, and it's very easy to make. You get a little saucepan, add however much sugar you want and an equal amount of water. You bring it to a boil and you let it cook until all the sugar is dissolved. That's it. You don't let it get brown. At that point, you're starting to get caramel, and when you add it to anything cold, it's going to solidify and crackle. Not what you're going for with tea. Pretty cool if you do that over ice cream, though. And then you can just stick it in a jar while it's hot, close it, let it cool, and you've actually got something that you can add a spoonful at a time to iced tea, and it'll actually mix in. Anyway, I hope you found that helpful and not too rambly. If you have any questions, pop them in the comment box down below. I love talking about tea. It's my favorite drink. I hope I gave you tips on how to brew your own perfect cup. Don't hesitate to experiment and figure out what you like. If you like stronger or weaker tea, if there's a particular technique that you like, let me know in the description box down below. I am always curious to try new stuff. That's why I have a Sips By box, and don't worry, a video on that is going to come out as soon as I get my next month's Sips By box so that I can open it and review it. I hope you found this useful. Happy crafting and happy tea drinking if you go for it. Bye.